Welcome back to A Shark's Perspective. So we know that marketing is changing, but how about how that is changing for the consumers who provide you data as a lead? Their intention and level of consent is changing too. So how do you keep up with that as a lead generation person, as well as document that customer journey? And what about the bad actors in the lead gen space who make this level of consent even that much more important to understand and protect yourself against? What's a good actor to do in order to build real trust with consumers? Ross Shanken is the CEO and founder of Jornaya, a technology platform helping marketers solve problems with better understanding the journey in lead generation. And on this episode, we'll discuss the lead generation landscape, intent, consent, the changing customer journey, especially with major life purchases, Conshohock in Pennsylvania, the evil Philadelphia Eagles, Journey's greatest hits, and a lot more. So let's tune in to a Jornaya journeyman with a journeyed shark on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Ross, thank you so much for joining me today on A Shark's Perspective. If you would, tell us a little bit about your background and your career to date thus far.
Sure. Glad to be here, Shark. So my background is generally summed up as being very entrepreneurial from the time I left college. I spent some time with new technologies, which back then was like fax on demand and then some pre-internet and early internet stuff. But then highlighted by two companies, one called Targus Info, where I was an early employee and was there for 13 years, and anybody in the lead gen space generally knew about Targus Info. We were a company that had a proprietary data set that helped a lot of companies, and especially those in performance marketing, understand real-time information about the people they were interacting with, and we could identify those people and add data attributes to those people to make the transactions more valuable. And then my next stop was where I am now with Jornaya, formerly known as Lead ID, and then some years into it, we rebranded as Jornaya, and that's been the last almost 9 years now, believe it or not. And we'll get into what Jornaya is doing, but generally all entrepreneurial stuff, and the vast majority of my career over 20 years being around utilizing proprietary data sets to help make interactions more valuable in some way.
Sure. Well, then what inspired you to start Jornaya in Lead ID, I guess, at the time? What was the problem, at least, the specific problem you were trying to solve?
Yeah, so after having exited Targus Info, I knew a lot about the lead gen space, and there was some core set of problems that nobody had yet solved, which was really around a lack of a central source to provide transparency to anyone transacting in the world of lead gen or performance marketing. A lack of transparency, a lack of performance data, and a lack of compliance data in one central source. So we started off with the mission to become that central source. And that, of course, had a lot of different challenges to it and a lot of opportunities that we had to pursue, which we can get into further in this dialogue, I'm sure. But that was the initial view. And then there was always this view that if we were able to pull that off successfully, that we'd become this central source of really interesting data that could help everybody in the industry in broader ways than only in the lead gen space. And that's, of course, what's happened as we've grown into our full opportunity at Jornaya. Sort of started off with our opportunity as Lead ID to provide that level of transparency across the industry.
So, you and I have talked before, and I think one of the things that's interesting is obviously you're in the middle of all of this, and I'm really curious, how do you stay independent as a tech company in the lead gen space that's independent? Because you're not selling leads, you're not monetizing it in the way that we would typically think of as a buyer and seller in the lead gen market. How do you stay sort of independent in this space?
Yeah, so that was a really important question to us early on, and we were fortunate to have thought about that quite a bit and spent a lot of time making sure that we were not ever going to be sort of tempted, and I'm not just talking about myself as the company grew. It can be very tempting to not stay independent. And whether that means that you are kind of judging players in the space instead of just
Exactly.
using data-driven models. And we always wanted to stick with, data-driven models. We used to, in the early days of Lead ID, we used to say, we're not saying what's good or bad, but we have all the facts, and you can make a decision about what's good or bad in terms of quality. Um, and then we would help in various ways to figure out the level of quality of the lead, but we never wanted to be that sort of take a personal stake in whether a lead was good or bad, for example. And so that was one guardrail that we set up really well early on, and became part of our DNA to this day, that we're a company that is in a unique position to collect a lot of data and bring it to bear to bring a lot of value. But we're not here to say who's a good player and a bad player, other than whatever the data tells us. And the second area that might have even been a bigger guardrail that we had to make sure we set up was never to make money on media. Because as you look at the temptation, if you look at the ad tech space, especially in 2011, that's where a lot of money was in the ad tech space. Like, let's just sell media. We'll bundle the data into it, but it's all cost per thousand impressions, and we can go make a ton of money. And we could have, and we probably made a lot less money by not doing
Yeah.
that. But it was, very clear that if you're ever participating in the media dollar, you are by definition not independent, and you're not able to be fully trusted as an independent certification source for leads, and then eventually for other kinds of transactions. So those two things are really solidly embedded in the DNA across our company as we continue to grow.
Well, marketing is obviously changing dramatically, especially with the way consumers want to be interacted with in between companies. And well, we met at a performance marketing conference, really, when you think about it. But we both spoken at several of the same performance marketing conferences. We have obviously mutual friends in this space, which is still a pretty broad and wide space. But how do you see the lead generation landscape today? Because there are plenty of people that we know. We won't name any of them, but ones that are helping move everything forward, and then there are plenty of people that we know that are not. We've still got a massive problem, at least in this industry, with all kinds of integrity around how we generate leads. But how do you see the landscape as a whole?
Yeah, so I think it's fairly simple how I see it, and I think it's probably pretty consistent with how you and many see it, which is, as you mentioned, there's a lack of integrity in some pockets and with some players, and all of that stems from one fundamental thing, which is, in the lead gen space at least, there's one party posting data to another party.
Mm-hmm.
And that data comes along with promise, multiple promises. So there might be promises of that it's a current lead, that it's a real person, it's not a bot. There might be a promise that I, as a lead seller, generated this lead myself, when in reality, maybe I didn't. There's a promise of this data was entered for the purposes that I'm stating it is entered for. So I'm giving a promise that this is an auto insurance intender,
Mm-hmm.
and was it really or not? And the recipient of that data that's being posted to them, there's no way for that recipient of the data to know whether or not any of those promises are true. It's just the nature of the technical workflow. And so, and this gets to the heart of why we started Lead ID and how we went about it. Our view was that data comes with a lot of promises, but there's no way to know if those promises are happening or not on a given transaction, and unless there were a technology that lived at the origin of that lead having been formed.
Hmm.
And then theoretically, you should be able to know everything, all the facts about how that lead was generated, how it changed hands along the way, and then the recipient of that data can, tap into all that information about the data and all that history, about the origin and history of that lead, and know if which of those promises are true or not. And so we don't, we used to get asked early on, like, oh, so you guys are the traffic cops for the industry. And it's like, no, not exactly, because we can't force people to use this, to use our platform. And we can't, and we're also not judging who's the good guys and the bad guys.
Right.
All we're doing is we were more like a VIN number and a Carfax,
Sure.
both of those things. Um, for the industry, but just like in the auto industry, you could sell a car without a Carfax, or if you're buying a used car, you might not know to ask for a Carfax. I think probably now you do. But so we never saw ourselves as directly being able to solve all the problems that are possible, but we did see ourselves as building a system that, if you utilize it, will solve all those problems, because you now know what you're buying. And if you're a seller, you now know you have a truly independent party telling the buyer that what they're buying is what you promised that they'd be buying. So that's kind of how we think about it.
So take your application, if you will, kind of describe it in a nutshell.
Yeah. So the lead ID application, and we'll talk about kind of some of the other areas we've grown into as Jornaya, which are kind of different from this. But the lead ID application was fairly straightforward in that, we were like a VIN number and Carfax. So our technology lives at the site of the form. So we often have our technology across the entire site, and but certainly resident on the page where the consumer is actually entering her data into a form.
Mm-hmm.
And by having our tech there, we're able to see exactly what happens. We're able to see all the content on the page. We're able to know the URL, we know device types, we can link different disparate events together, so we can learn various things that are helpful to the seller and buyer in that process. We basically know everything that there is to know, that a technology like Google Analytics could collect, for example,
Sure.
about the origin of that, how that lead became entered. And we also our tech issues a unique identifier to that website. And so the only change we asked the industry to do all those years ago was, if the lead seller was posting a lead to the lead buyer, we said, do that exactly as you do it today, except add one field to the post, which is our unique lead ID that we issued to you, Mr. Lead Seller,
Mm-hmm.
or that we issued to the originator of this lead, and and you're aggregating it. Well, you have to get that lead ID tag from them. So we really, all we did was say, this lead ID tag, which is unique for every lead event, should become a currency in the industry. That anyone buying a lead should ask for the lead ID, just like you would ask for your Carfax. And then everyone selling a lead should be including a lead ID token as part of the post. And that's all it takes. And then to implement our technology on the website is very easy. It's a snippet of code that you drop in, and the more complex your website is, there might be some wrinkles to that. But so we wanted to make it technically very easy. We wanted to make it free, no cost to putting this code on your site, and then make it really easy for all the workflows in the industry. So we were saying the workflows don't change. Leads are still being posted, but now they're posted with this lead VIN number, if you will. And then the recipient of that lead can, in real time, query us with that VIN number or that lead ID. And they also query us often with the lead information, so that we can give them back the equivalent of the Carfax report in real time. Here's a lot of facts about the origin and history of this lead that you just purchased or that you're considering purchasing. So like a lot of our stuff ended up showing up in bidding engines, and we were helping the bidders on leads or other performance media make decisions about if they did want to buy the lead at all. And if so, how much do they want to pay for it based on all these quality indicators that we had, and we built some compliance indicators and all that. So from a workflow perspective, it's super easy to implement code on the site. It's free. And then the only difference in the workflows across the industry is this lead ID token is now part of the lead flow across the industry. And that's it.
Yeah, and having worked for Axiom, I mean, it sparks memories of their Abilitech ID. So that's one way of, for me to kind of make sense of it as well. And I sort of think of it as like blockchain for lead generation in some form or fashion. It's a way to at least track it throughout a journey as opposed to just wondering where it comes in the next time. So,
yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. I think it's not using blockchain technology,
right.
but it's a similar outcome of this, to your point. And the only difference with the Abilitech key is the Abilitech key is tied to a person or household.
Exactly.
We can link our lead ID to a person or household, but the unique lead ID is really about the unique lead event.
Agreed.
So if one person shows up on 5 sites that our tech is on, they would have 5 different lead IDs, but we'd likely be able to tie them together and know that it's the same person, just like Abilitech would. But we also then can know that this one person went to 5 different sites or filled out 5 different forms.
Yeah, just wanted to sound smart and weave in a blockchain metaphor. So it didn't
I think
work.
You sounded really smart, Stark. So I appreciate that.
Well, another thing we have to think about is not every lead is a great lead is a great lead, and I think this happens so often with people who are buying leads or producing leads that they end up selling. But there's so many different kinds of problems that we have to consider with the leads, whether it's time delay, whether somebody's given consent, compliance, how much is the value of that intent and so forth. How does this help solve that problem as well, especially with time delay and consent?
Sure. Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I'll tell a story about. So in 2011, I started Lead ID, now Jornaya, and the original prototype that we built and the first version of our offering, we could put code on the site, we could issue a lead ID. It wasn't all that hard, and then a lead seller could transfer that lead ID to a lead buyer. The lead buyer could query us, and we built all that. The response to our query initially in 2011 was a lot of raw data that was kind of less actionable because it didn't answer these questions that you just asked, like time delay. We gave a time and date that the lead was first filled out, and they could do the calculation on their end of the time delay, but that was it was less actionable. They had to do work to actually get the answer. Or TCPA consent, we could say, hey, this content was shown on the site, but they had to figure out, was that content, did it match their compliance requirements, for example. So in 2011, and the other problem with that was our prototype would have shared a lot of proprietary website data that the lead seller didn't want to share, and we didn't need to share. So we had this notion. I was on the plane on my way to an industry conference in the fall of 2011, and the plane was delayed for multiple hours. And I was sitting out on the tarmac, and I was like racking my brain about this problem we had, and I started writing out kind of like what are the questions that lead buyers are really asking, and what do lead sellers really want to certify? It's not the raw data. They want answers to the questions like you just brought up, like. Is this really a consumer with intent?
Yeah.
Did this consumer give compliance, give consent to be dialed, which was even an issue prior to 2013 when TCPA really took off. But
am I going to get sued for calling them?
Yes, am I going to get sued for calling them? That's the question. That's all they care about. Is this lead really a fresh lead? And this gets back to the promises, like, it could be a delayed lead and the buyer doesn't know it. And so I wrote out all these questions. I ended up getting off the plane. We got deplaned. And then by the time I was going to be able to make it out to this conference and go on stage, it was too late. So I went back to my office and met with that afternoon with our CTO and co-founder and said, let's just whiteboard all these questions, and then we should make our product answers to these questions.
Mm.
So that's a long-winded, a story about how we answer these questions. We know the exact microsecond when a lead was formed and when it was originated, and then we know when a buyer queries us, and we know the time differential between them. And so a lot of our lead buying customers, they want to know that in real time when they're buying a lead. And we give them that information immediately, and we know it definitively to answer that question. And so am I going to get sued? We can't exactly answer that because even when you do everything right,
Right.
with consent, you still can get sued. But what we can tell you is definitively, did this person provide consent? Did this person see a conspicuous disclosure that you might be calling them or texting them? And by conspicuous, we can have all kinds of settings of font sizes and color contrast. And so all of the compliance departments that are using our service can set their own parameters and say, well, if the disclosure was there, but it was 2-point font, that doesn't count. I don't want to touch that lead. I don't want to call that lead because it's a high risk lead. But if it was 10-point font or greater and it was a high enough contrast, I know definitively now that I have proof of consent. And if I ever need Jornaya's help, I can go back to them and we store that data in perpetuity for any of our TCPA customers. So, and those are just a couple examples, but all the questions that a lead buyer would want answered, we're able to answer it because we're there at the origination of the site.
Mm-hmm.
And if a lead ID had been the currency traveling with that lead throughout the industry, we can also answer how many people have touched it and various other questions that are important to lead buyers.
It's really interesting just from a time delay standpoint how much that can mean as well to when a lead converts. And it's as simple as within a few minutes to within a few hours, and they don't remember filling out that form, to even when you get a Glengarry lead and it's 2 weeks later because it sat in your system and you're trying to figure out, am I allowed to call that person? So I always have found it very interesting having been in this space. So then you've got your code populated across tens of thousands of sites, and I'd love to know, how are you seeing people, basically the hand raisers that are expressing intent for people's products, especially for, as you guys talk about, those change of life issues. How are people hand raising to spark that interest that turns into what you're seeing is what eventually evolves into a lead?
Sure. Yeah. So, the sort of key to the answer there's a lot of opinions or sort of points of view of what correlates to intent. And I think pretty early on, we sort of said, well, we got to think about it a little bit differently because nobody really knows what a consumer's intent is except for that consumer.
Right.
And I would argue even in some cases, the person doesn't even know it about themselves.
Yeah.
But certainly somebody from the outside viewing it is going to have a point of view about their intent. But where the proof's in the pudding is if you can correlate certain actions by a consumer, certain behaviors by a consumer, and also correlate certain data points like we just talked about time delay and how old is the lead and how many times have we seen this person expressing some kind of intent, whether it's just visiting a site, just spending a lot of time on a site. We track all that stuff. How many fields did they fill out? Did they really fill out a lead form or not? Did they fill it out on multiple sites or just on one, but they visited a lot of other sites? And ultimately, a proxy for intent is what happened next and what eventually happened. Did they end up engaging with this company? Did they end up buying something with some company somewhere? And so we ended up pretty early on getting outcome data from our customers. And we shared with them that, hey, if you can share outcome data with us, we can actually start to correlate all this data we have with outcomes that you're interested in having, which
Mm-hmm.
are usually around acquisition or retention or size of of customer and things like that. And so really you can build data models, which we did early on, and we've gotten more and more sophisticated over time, where um, if you don't even, you want the answers to some of these questions anyway,
Mm-hmm.
but ultimately if the big questions are like, how likely is it that this person, this lead will become a customer of mine and when, you can model all of that against data and kind of play the odds in your favor across a big group of leads that you're buying over time. Um, and so we sort of call that intent. Like if a person is very likely to buy from someone, they
Mm-hmm.
have high intent.
Sure.
If our data tells us that, if they aren't likely to buy from someone, we're saying they're low intent. And it's not really the true definition of intent, but that's kind of how we make it work in the real world of marketing.
So then let's start laying out what the value is to each of the parties. How does a consumer benefit?
Sure. Yeah, so the consumers become more and more in focus for us over the years as well. We always thought about the consumer early on, but with privacy regulations increasing, as well as the problems that you noted earlier in the discussion about there's all sorts of shenanigans that go on
Yeah.
in certain pockets of the lead gen space. Those shenanigans are bad for the consumer, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the biggest problem a consumer has outside of their data being kept private is the spam that hits their mostly it's their telephone, it's their
Mm-hmm.
mobile phone now. So they're getting all these calls. So like often when I'm explaining to family members what I do, and I'm like, hey, by the way, you should be really hesitant to fill out a lead form online if it's
Right.
not directly with the brand. And here's why: because you're going to get your phone hammered after that in certain cases. In others, people are doing it right, and that doesn't happen. But it happens enough that it's really bad for consumers. So we kind of look at we're doing two things for consumers, which is the same two things we're doing for marketers, but just from a different point of view. Um, by by sort of giving the facts about this lead that this consumer gave in, we are helping marketers not spam the consumer. If it wasn't really this consumer who gave her information, if it wasn't really an exclusive lead or only sold to 4 brands, well, you don't want to be, that 15th brand that is now spamming this consumer. The marketer doesn't actually want to be that guy. Most of them don't. And the consumer doesn't want that call. And so we look at the one thing for consumers that we're doing is we are helping change the industry to such a place where they're going to get calls or emails or direct mail that's actually more relevant to them and more timely when they really need it. And they're not going to get overwhelmed just by giving their information out. The second area is the privacy aspect. And, just like with TCPA, we're adding a lot of privacy value there by making sure that this person actually gave her consent to be dialed or texted, SMS. And now we're on January 1st, we're actually adding in a CCPA privacy indicator so that anyone interacting with this individual or anyone accepting data about this individual knows that they're in California, that they have seen a disclosure, that they've consented to that disclosure, and we have proof of that. So similar to TCPA. And we're going to continue seeing more and more privacy regulations, and our view is that we want to help the industry with all of that. And by doing so, we're actually helping the consumer keep her data private or out of databases that she doesn't want them.
Yeah, I was going to specifically ask you about how this applies to the buyers and sellers as well, but I think you've really kind of checked off pretty much every box in that statement, and that's how it benefits consumers. And I think one of the things that's interesting too is the more that you look at uh, really kind of this honest transparency with this, is it does sort of eliminate you even I mean, it gives you a way to question a lot of the lead sellers pretty early on as to whether or not their leads are consensual, quality, with intent, and followed compliance. I mean, it just prevents you going from deep into a hole that you don't need to go.
Absolutely, absolutely. And like what we always said from day one is, you can figure out which sellers are not the good ones and
Yeah,
which ones are the good ones. And that said, what we really want to help you figure out any lead you ever touch. You can know in real time, is it a good lead or not?
exactly.
And
Yeah.
is it a real lead? And what's the value? And I don't even care where it came from. If there's a group that you've had a bad experience with in the past as lead sellers, but they have good leads, you're going to know it. If there's a group that you've had no issues with, but we're showing that there are some issues in some of their leads, you're going to know it. And you can almost not even care who the lead seller is anymore, because it's kind of like if you're going to buy a used car, it might be the place has a bad reputation, but if they happen to have a good car, you can now buy it because
Mm-hmm.
you know it's a good car based on the Carfax.
When we were, you mentioned consent as well earlier. Do you see consent as more of a problem than it's been in the past, or less of one today?
I think it depends on the context you're asking. Like, I like to think that it's less of a problem for our customers today because we
Yeah.
have a pretty buttoned down solution, and that's been sort of shown. Um, the big problem for marketers with consent is if they don't receive it based on the regulations, and they need to call or text this individual in order to make their business work the way it needs to work. Um, Without any good solution in place, you're really rolling the dice with a big risk that you're putting on your company's head
Oh yeah.
when you look at 8-figure and 9-figure lawsuits that occur. So their big challenge is sort of, it's not very inspiring. Like, it doesn't really help them, but it helps their marketing to be able to call or text. And there's sort of a very straightforward ways now. We offer a solution that covers a lot of bases. Doesn't cover every base of TCPA required, but pretty much it covers every base of consent and proof of consent forever. And so for a really low cost against all that risk, you can virtually eliminate any real meaningful risk, and you can get back to work marketing. So I think from a marketer's perspective, there are solutions now that make consent less of a problem than in the early years of the TCPA expansion. For the consumer, I think it's a better world than it was, because there's a lot more energy and activity and disclosures placed around the web. When I talk to kind of people who aren't in the industry as consumers, they're really kind of confused about it all. And so I don't know if they feel any better. They probably feel worse than they did a few years ago, because they're sort of, there's this fear of, my data is going to be stolen and my identity is going to be compromised, and all this stuff that I don't think the layman consumer understands actually
Yeah, agreed.
what's actually happening. And then from a legal perspective, I would say it's as problematic as ever. You've got serial plaintiffs, you've got attorneys trying to make money off companies that don't have themselves protected against proving consent. And so that's rampant right now. And, it's maybe one of the unintended downsides of trying to do the right thing by consumers with regulation and proper, marketing.
Yeah, I don't even know what I would answer to that, because we've got so many regulations that the folks that are honest in the space know well and observe. But there's so many bad actors that are still doing the wrong thing, and I don't
Yeah.
know. Seems like as quickly as we put up something to fix something, then they tear it down and try to hack into another path. So, what is the value then to lead buyers and sellers and performance marketers as well, outside of just the consumers, but the ones on the on the corporate side that are producing and creating these leads?
Yeah. So, like we talked about with the value to consumers, I think covered some of the bases that are good for everybody, not just consumers. So if you have a great consumer transaction and experience, then by definition, it's good for the marketer. And if the performance marketer and lead seller does it right, it's also great for them because they have a party like Jornaya certifying that they do it right. So, to some earlier points in this dialogue, um, the lead sellers who are doing things right or the performance marketers who are doing things right actually pay the price for those that aren't,
Yes.
because the buyers of that media or of those leads don't know how to distinguish the difference other than if you're certified by an independent party. And so the lead sellers get a lot of additional value by saying, hey, I've got this independent party in Jornaya who is telling you, I'm not telling you, but they are actually certifying that my stuff's not the bad stuff. My stuff's the good stuff. I'm handling consent the right way. I'm actually getting you data that's fresh and current, and all the other shenanigans that some others in the industry might be doing, I'm not doing, and this third party is telling you so.
So you guys also run your own performance marketing conference as well every year called the Journey Summit. Tell me about that. How did that get started, and what year are you in on this?
Yeah, so we are really proud of our conference, and it's held every year here in Philadelphia, and where our company's based. And I think a lot of our customers and partners have found that a nice thing, because it's kind of a novel city to have a conference, and it was also just named in one of the top 25 destination cities in the U.S., which is we're really proud of. Um, and so this started, the genesis of the Journey Summit was actually prior to starting the Journey Summit. We used to have a lot of in the early years of Lead ID, we did a lot of work in the education space.
Sure.
And we had a lot of education buyers who wanted to get together and kind of solve common problems using this independent platform that we had started developing and bringing to the industry. So we actually had our first EDU Summit, is what we called it, in 2012. And it was a group of about 15 people, so it was a real small thing. And then we had two more of those, and it got up to about 50 people at its max. And then as we started growing into other industries like financial services and banking and various insurance categories and then automotive, car buying and selling, we recognize that we have a broader things to bring to the market in the conference than just education. And also, as we launched Activate, which is sort of a broader use of all this data in partnership with our lead seller and publisher partners, that we were telling a much bigger story. And this kind of gets to why we rebranded as Jornaya. And that's when we had our first Journey Summit, was in 2017. Let's see, 2017. No, it was 2016, in the fall of 2016. And then we just had our third Journey Summit in April of this year. And we'll have our fourth in May of 2020. It'll be on May 5th, 2020. And the basic premise of the summit is there's all of these, what we call major life purchase marketers out there. And there's all these partners, whether they be lead sellers, performance marketers, or other platforms like some of which you've had on your show, like Invoca and Drips, and other partners that are supporting ultimately what is really challenging for these marketers, which is I actually want to do the right thing. I want to have great customer and consumer experiences. I don't always have the data or the technology or the know-how to ensure that I'm talking to people when they want to be talked to, and I'm actually doing a good job of consent and making really good, relevant, timely consumer experiences. That's what marketers really want. And in the world of major life purchase marketing, it's even more complex because these purchases don't happen in 30 seconds or a minute like they do with Amazon. These are taking place over weeks or months. And I, as the marketer, need to be stewarding these great consumer journeys. And if I do a great job of that, they're more likely to buy from me. And that's my job now. And so what we found is that across all these major life purchase industries, like I just mentioned, uh, this is a common problem that marketers are all facing, and their partners want to help them with it. And it's a big, confusing world of marketing technology. And so we wanted to call together a conference of, I think last year was about 250 people. This year will probably be 300 plus, of like-minded marketers who have these like challenges, and how are we overcoming them today and making great strides, and then how are we all thinking about overcoming them tomorrow? So that's kind of what the conference is all about.
Well, and you've had speakers that nobody's really ever heard about, like Jonah Berger and then Seth Godin.
Yes.
So not
Yeah,
exactly
we love that.
nothing to sneeze at there with getting Seth Godin anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, so we felt it was really important not only to have ourselves talking with each other as an industry, which is really the primary purpose of the conference, but there are some great thinkers. You just mentioned two of them,
Yeah, no
who
kidding.
are kind of thinking differently about the world. And I'll tell you, both of their presentations, Jonah's and Seth's, were incredible. Seth, I think, brought the house down, and the feedback was incredible, and I was blown away. He's always been a personal hero of mine for a long time, and got to spend a couple of minutes with him along the way, and super guy. He's everything that you think he is. And really what they're doing is they're sort of saying that the world is changing. So don't kind of rely on the things that you grew up with in your industry as a marketer. I mean, it's changing fast, and we all know that. What are we doing about it? Are we stuck in the old kinds of ways of thinking, or let's break out and talk about how the consumer experience really works in today's world, and it's changing fast, and let's make sure we as marketers are paying attention to all that and being good stewards of ultimately what's our job at our companies.
So you mentioned Activate earlier. How does that play into the whole equation of leveraging Jornaya?
Sure. So, when you think about like lead gen, I think we've grown up thinking lead gen is its own unique thing that lives within the broader world of marketing, and it is. But at the same time, it really is all about, like we talked about earlier in the discussion, a consumer who has intent to buy something, or who's thinking about buying something, and they need more information, they need more help. And when it comes to the world of major life purchases, they need a lot of help. Most people haven't bought a house before, or they bought one or two, and it's a big financial purchase. It's a big emotional risk. People don't know how to do it well. Same with cars, and same with mortgages and insurances. And so we really think about part of our mission is to help make consumer major life purchase experiences exceptional. And the more marketers we work with, they would love that. They want to make their experiences with consumers exceptional. Consumers, of course, would love that. But we often get caught up in the world of, like, is it lead, or is it a click, or is it a call, or is it brand marketing? But holistically, it's about making great consumer experiences. And so one thing we realized early on at Lead ID was, we talked about all the data we bring to bear to help make leads more effective for the seller and the buyer. But one interesting fact is that only about 5 to 10% of visitors to a lead gen site become a lead. So interesting, 100 people visit a lead gen website. They visited for some reason, and maybe there's a couple percentage points that made a mistake, but most of them visited for a reason. They are interested in something about a mortgage or a car. So there's some signal of intent, but only about 5 to 10% of those visitors become a lead that can be monetized by the lead seller, and that can be acted upon by the brand. And so the question we asked ourselves was, well, the other 90% of people who have expressed intent, what could we do with that? And how could we leverage that data to help the lead sellers who aren't monetizing that data today, and help the brands connect to those people? And so that's what when we launched Activate in 2018, but we rebranded as Jornaya in 2016. It was with that thought in mind.
Mm-hmm.
We want to look at the holistic consumer journey. We want to be the party that brings all the data about the consumer journey into one central source and allow the sellers of that data to benefit from that and allow the brands to leverage that data to connect to consumers at the right time with the right message so they have very relevant engagements and they have exceptional experiences. And that's, in a nutshell, what Activate helps the industry to do now. And so it's a much broader industry than just lead gen or lead buyers. Like we work with a lot of banks today that don't really buy leads, or they buy some, but it's not the biggest part of their marketing. The biggest part of their marketing is marketing to their existing customers and their existing prospects at the right time with the right message in order to have the best experiences and ultimately then the best outcome.
Well, and it's really important, especially as you think of complex sales. People aren't, seeing one ad, going somewhere, filling out a form, and click, boom, it's done. I mean, that may work for an e-commerce purchase of a makeup brush, but for something you're doing in banking, for example, I mean, that's could have a much longer tail. So you've got to follow that tail a lot more than you would have if it was a smaller purchase. But I think this also plays into what I've seen a lot of presentations from Rand Fishkin talk about recently, and that is how few searches are clickable today, how we're starting to see those numbers go down. So people are not just clicking that one ad and going through. It's going to be something that we're going to have to look at the first part of the journey to really understand their intent a lot better than we did, say, just a couple of years ago as this keeps changing.
That's a great example. Yep.
Well, Ross, I've never heard of a shark attack off the Delaware River, but you're on a shark's perspective. So I have to ask, I don't know if George Washington saw any crossing the Delaware, crossing the river, but what is your favorite kind of shark and why?
Well,
not your
I
typical,
can't say
not
I'm
your
a shark
typical,
aficionado.
yeah.
So I don't know. I have to think for a second. And, I could say my favorite shark is you.
There you go.
Now, because I got to know you a little bit recently, but that might sound disingenuous. So,
No, that's okay. You've got the right intent.
And from the little bit that I know, and I might actually be wrong in this because I don't know much about sharks, but I've got some friends who are divers, and I think they've said that hammerheads are not actually, they've dived with hammerheads, and they've been able to kind of do so without feeling like they're at risk of any danger. I don't know if that's true or not, but if that's true.
You've always got to respect their territory. Hammerheads can be aggressive, but they're absolutely beautiful to dive with, and like any other, tigers are more aggressive than hammerheads. But can you dive with tigers?
Naturally.
Can you dive with tigers all day long? Absolutely. And for me, the only ones that you're in their territory, so you've got to respect. I don't joke with people every time I dive. I don't, stick a Cheeto in my mouth and ask a shark to come get it. But if you do it the right way, it's an amazing experience. So
that's incredible. Well, I have seen pictures of hammerheads, and they are beautiful. And so without any further knowledge, I'll stick that one in there as my second favorite shark.
There you go.
I'll still say you're my favorite.
There you go. All right. Well, Ross, it's a special time of the show. Are you ready for the 5 most interesting and important questions you're going to be asked today?
Sure.
Right. Number 1, LeadsCon or Connect to Convert?
LeadsCon.
Agreed. Number 2, Philadelphia Eagles or the Philadelphia 76ers?
Eagles, only because I've been going to games since I was 4 years old. The Sixers are a better team right now, but I got to say Eagles.
Do you hate the Cowboys?
Yes.
Boo. All right, number 3. It's a Journey Summit / Journey question. The rock group Journey. Faithfully or Don't Stop Believing?
Don't Stop Believing.
There you go.
Not even hard.
Exactly.
But, I was a big fan of Faithfully as a teenager, romantic sap. But Don't Stop Believing. Much better song.
Agreed. Number 4, 2 types of different compliance regulations. I don't know that you can necessarily have a favorite, but let's make a choice as it applies to you and where you are. TCPA or CCPA?
I would probably say TCPA.
This is really a Sophie's choice, you know?
Yeah, only because I think it was fairly clear, and even if it was misguided in the way it was written and far-reaching, it's very clear what the intent is.
Yeah.
I feel like CCPA is still a work in progress, and I think it's going to be this way for a while.
Once we get 49 more regulations as well.
Yeah. My hope is that regulators can kind of get smarter about how this stuff really needs to work, because the world's not going to operate without data being transferred. And if you kind of make it too draconian, it's not going to happen, and you're not really helping. So I don't think we're there yet, but I think that could surpass TCPA as my favorite if it's done right. Once it's done right.
Agreed. Number 5, and the most important question that you're going to be asked today is, and there's probably at least one Cracker Barrel in Conshohocken, Pennsylvania, where you are. Biscuits or cornbread?
Cornbread.
Good man. So, Ross, where do you want people to find out more about you, your company, learn about the cause, and more?
Yeah, really, our website it sounds so pedestrian these days, but it's probably the best place. We put a lot of time into it. We're going to continue to. So it's our company website. We're also fairly strong on LinkedIn across our company handle, as well as all the individuals that work here. So those would be 2 good resources.
And I'll definitely put the Jornaya website on the webpage. So, Ross, thank you again very much for being with us today on A Shark's Perspective.
Thank you so much, Shark.
So there was my conversation with Ross Shanken, the CEO and founder of Jornaya, a technology platform helping marketers solve problems with better understanding the journey in lead generation. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from my conversation with him. First, nothing more important in lead gen than integrity. So somebody buying leads, the recipient of that data, has no way to typically verify the promises that a lead generator has made. But if you're buying leads or trying to make sales, it's extremely important to verify that integrity, not only because of the relationship you develop with customers, but also because it's a substantial legal issue. There's so much needed protection for consumers so that lead companies don't take advantage of that relationship in the wrong way. Yet there are still enough bad actors out there who make this a problem for the rest of us. So whether you're buying a piece of tech, to look at that or not, give some added focus to consent as well as compliance, and don't use those bad actors. Second, consumers should feel more comfortable about providing their information on a lead form, but don't, because most companies will call and email and overwhelm you completely. Not enough companies pay enough attention to privacy with that data either. So why should anyone be surprised as to why this process is becoming more difficult with more legislation coming into place? They shouldn't be. Want to be a good lead gen disruptor? Build some real trust through transparency in that process with potential customers. Show them what you're doing ahead of time with their data, not by providing some 20-page doc that your legal team prepared, but instead by your business practices that will keep them coming back. And remember that those leads, if they get misused and abused, well, those consumers won't remember the media company who produced the lead for you. They'll only remember how bad your brand logo ruined the experience. And then they'll move on to one of the many other options. Third, marketing is changing. We hear this all the time, but to make those experiences amazing, do not forget that you've got to also understand how intent and consent is evolving with that journey as well. And that's especially true with these longer tail journeys that come with major life purchases and complex sales. Just look at non-click searches as an example and how that's evolving. Documenting that longer journey now becomes that much more important. Got a question? Send me an email to kenneth@asharksperspective.com. Thank you again for the privilege of your time, and I hope that I'm your favorite shark too. So please join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.